Good morning and welcome to, we are on day 2 of the People's Summit and the panel today is Central Ontario Connectivity. My name is Brad Fauteux and I'm lucky enough to be a board member with Wildlands League, and I'm excited and feel very honored to be your moderator today. I'm joined by a really esteemed panel that I'll get to in just a little bit. I would like to do an acknowledgement of the land that I find myself on today, and I'm in Toronto, Ontario. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of any number of nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And that really, Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I'd also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I honor and offer respect to elders past and present and to their children who are the elders of the future. I also want to acknowledge that historically in the last 24 hours that the Canadian Senate has passed Bill C-15, which provides a framework for the alignment of Canadian law with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so it's an important step towards one day hopefully eliminating the Indian Act. So now that I've made a land acknowledgement, and I appreciate having the opportunity to make that acknowledgement, we are honored to have 8 speakers here with us today who are going to share their stories about the special places, and in particularly the idea of connectivity of conservation places. But first off, we had a question that was posed to the audience as part of a poll, and so I'll ask that the question be shown up on the screen. And so far, I still see my panelists' smiling faces. So the question was, and I'll just move on with that, what percentage of Ontario is currently protected? And the 4 choices were A, 3.8%, B, 5.6%, C, 10.7%, or D, 45.3%. And so it looks to me like in the poll, the top answer was C, and C is the correct answer. Right now, Ontario stands at 10.7% protection. And so just under 11, but obviously a far cry from the 25% that is the more global commitment that's been made, and at the federal government level here in Canada as well. So 73% got the right answer, excellent. Only the optimists chose D at 43%, and we'll get there. So I'd like to just run through and introduce our speakers. We've got a really great lineup of folks that are going to join us today. We're going to start off with my friend Dave Pearce, and Dave is the Senior Forest Conservation Manager with Wildlands League. He's going to talk to us about Queen Elizabeth Wildlands. After Dave, we'll have Shelley Hunt and Paul Heaven. Shelley is the Chair of the Board of Directors with the Haliburton Highlands Land Trust. And Paul is a Senior Wildlife Biologist with the Glenside Ecological Services Group in Minden. They'll be talking about protecting the Highlands corridor. Gary Pritchard will join us after that. He's a conservation ecologist and Indigenous engagement specialist with Curve Lake First Nation. He'll be talking about the Jacks Lake area just near Petroglyphs Provincial Park. After that, we'll have Katie Krelove and Peter Quinby, who will talk to us about protecting rare old growth forests in the Catchacoma forest area, just a little bit east of Kawartha Highlands Provincial Park. Katie's an Ontario campaigner with the Wildish community. And Peter is the Ancient Forest Explorations and Research, one of the principals with that group there. After that, we'll have John Kintare. John is the Executive Director of the Kawartha Land Trust. He'll talk to us about East Kawartha Lakelands. We'll have a video from Mark Bisset, the Executive Director of the Couchiching Conservancy, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end. The full speaker bios are in the People's Summit website if you wanted to check those out. We'll have time for a moderated Q&A at the end. If you put your questions into the Q&A box, we'll watch what comes in and we'll try to answer some of those at the end. And our friend Ian Attridge is here to receive those questions and moderate those questions. Speakers, it will be important for us to all be on time, of course, and so you'll get a gentle warning as you get to the end of your time. And for everybody, this is a technology event, and so anything could happen. We're all experts at Zoom calls at this point, but if we do have some issues as we go along, rest assured we'll be working hard to resolve them. So, with all that having been said, I will introduce my friend Dave Pearce, and he will start us off with Queen Elizabeth Wildlands. Dave.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for the introduction. I hope everybody can see my slide up there and hear me okay. If you can't, let me know. And the title of my talk, I am going to touch on Queen Elizabeth II Wildlands Park, no relation to our organization, by the way. But I'm going to go a bit beyond that. But I'm going to try to be brief because we have a stack of talented speakers and in-depth presentations on the landscape. And again, I'm going to defer to Brad's land acknowledgement because I'm also in the current city of Toronto. But so that was very eloquent, and thank you for that. And I am on the territory of many Indigenous peoples, past and current. So just really appreciate your land acknowledgement, Brad. So Wildlands League has a mandate to protect wild areas, and currently that meant working on unceded or public land or crown lands to create protection, and working with industry, mostly forestry, to lessen the impact of industry on lands outside of protected areas. Next slide, please. But about 3 years ago, I think we were exposed to the Bowman and Cortez connectivity work in conjunction with talk of improving ecological integrity and expanding Queen Elizabeth II Wildlands Provincial Park. And we were inspired, as I think a lot of people were, as they were exposed to this work, and people that have worked on this landscape for a long time, to consider, for us, moving from working primarily on crown land to actually working with private land players, mostly land trusts, on the landscape. Now this area, Central Ontario, it's over 50% private land. And so it's necessary to work on the private land. And it's really the genesis of what we were calling our Nature Connectivity Project. And that's kind of the title or framework in which a lot of our relatively new Southern Ontario work fits. And we're working with a lot of other groups, including the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition that Shelley Pritchard talked about yesterday. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to most of the other groups in this session, our original work, again, started around 3 years ago, included Greg Wickwary at Haliburton Highlands, included in this session, Gary Pritchard was leading in Indigenous engagement for us, as well as Kawartha Land Trust and Mark at Couchiching, and Ian Attridge was kind of advising us with his expertise. So in addition to those groups, we also work with Bill Lougheed at the Georgian Bay Land Trust over on the west side of the map, the area that Bill and his group work in, as well as Scott Young at Muskoka Land Trust up in the Bracebridge, Graverhurst, and up further north area, and Kristen Ferguson at Nature's Conservancy of Canada, as well as Alison Howson from the Ontario Land Trust Alliance. And some of the local members of the Ontario Park staff were very helpful in this project. So Wildlands League role was mostly one of coordination of this group, and we worked to develop a conservation heat map and a portion of a much larger proposal that went into the Environment and Climate Change Canada Challenge Fund process. Now, we weren't totally successful in that fund proposal, but it did result in funding for the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition, SONC, or SONC, as some people call it, work that Shelley talked about yesterday. That area abuts the area that we're currently in. So one thing we noticed is how far the Greenbelt actually comes north on the east side of Lake Simcoe up here. And when we started looking at this map in conjunction with the connectivity map we showed earlier, Janet Sumner, my executive director, asked the question, is it possible to connect protection from the Greenbelt all the way to Algonquin Park and from Georgian Bay over to Kawartha Highlands? And that was part of the project that we worked on a few years ago. So Brad, if you could just advance, I think one, again, and again. When we're thinking about connectivity, there's already sort of a stepping stone model of connectivity of these pink areas, which are enhanced management areas, which are not protected. They still allow forestry in them, but they do have special regulations that try to maintain the remote character mostly for recreational purposes, but there's some side benefits for ecology. And they're managed in this way partly because they're kind of unattractive to the forest industry. They're either remote or the timber values are very low. It's, you know, open Canadian shield and kind of barren and scattered areas. So there is an opportunity here. And this is where Wildlands League has a kind of a, I guess, comparative advantages. And we work on Crown land a lot, is working with forest companies in Ontario to eventually, at some point, get some of these areas into protection. And then we'll go to the last slide. And the work that I talked about, the group that I talked about earlier on the working on the Challenge Fund proposal, we did develop a very sophisticated heat map that I just felt was not appropriate to share with this like right now because it's not quite ready for prime time. But it did identify connections through a mixture of unceded Crown land, existing protected areas, and the future protection of private lands from the Greenbelt to QE2 up through here on the Carden Plain areas in here, from Georgian Bay to QE2 Provincial Park, up north and east, including private lands in between and some Crown lands between these stepping stones up to Algonquin, and then over to Kawartha Highlands. And I know that the remaining partners and the other people presenting in this session have continued the vision and this work to maintain and enhance and protect those connections, and even extend further over east of Kawartha Highlands over towards petroglyphs and Silent Lake, that area. So I'm very excited to see them present on their discrete areas of work in the next few presentations. So that's all I have to say. I hope it kind of sets up and whets your appetite for what the others have to say and some of the great work they're doing on the ground. Thanks very much.
That's terrific. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave. Fascinating. And of course, one day when the heat map is available, it will really be impactful for people to see the movement of wildlife and how that connectivity really works. And so wonderful work. It's really great to have it shared here. We will move. There we go. And so we move from Dave, and we've got our friends Shelley Hunt and Paul Heaven here. And so Shelley, I think you're going to go. Are you going first?
Yep.
All right.
Kick off the presentation.
Wonderful. I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, and great to hear from Dave. I was really excited to hear your presentation. I think what we're going to talk about meshes really nicely with your presentation as well. I'll just start off with a quick acknowledgement that in Haliburton here, where I am today, we're situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe-Mississauga lands and the traditional territory covered by the Williams Treaties. And I just want to express our gratitude for the opportunity to work in this area and acknowledge the many thousands of years of stewardship by Indigenous peoples. So thank you so much. So I'm really happy to be here representing the Haliburton Highlands Land Trust. And I'm going to be talking today about a very special area that we're calling the Highlands Corridor. And this is an area we've been working on in collaboration with partners like Ontario Nature and Paul Heaven of Glenside Ecological Services, who I'm going to be introducing in a minute or two. You know, here we are in beautiful Haliburton County, and most people, I think, or many people, think about Haliburton as a bit of an outdoor playground, as a place to sort of get away from it all and be close to nature and enjoy the bountiful forests and lakes and that sort of thing. But I think what is less well known about the area among the general public especially is that it's also an area that really harbors an abundance of sensitive habitats and species at risk, and that these are still vulnerable to pressures like development and resource extraction and the impacts of climate change. And over the past several years, the Land Trust, the Haliburton Highlands Land Trust, has been working with partners to try to learn more about the natural heritage of the area, with the idea of finding out the needs for conservation and for protection and prioritizing areas for further protection. So one of the things that has sort of emerged from all of this work, to just find out more about what we have here in our backyard, one of the things that has emerged is this concept that we're calling the Highlands Corridor. So Brad, if we could go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. Okay, great. So just to orient you a little bit about where we're talking about here before I turn it over to Paul. So here we have a sort of a map of central Ontario. You can see existing protected areas in green. We have the outline of Haliburton County in orange. And we can see this sort of swath of land stretching from Georgian Bay down into Eastern Ontario. And we can see where the gaps are in terms of protected areas there. And that red curvy arrow is the general, kind of the general reach of what we're calling the Highlands Corridor. It kind of stretches among 3 different provincial parks, and the outlines may not be completely carved in stone, but it does contain a large proportion of Crown land. And as far as, you know, this being a great candidate for further protection in terms of helping Ontario with its, you know, promises to increase protected areas, just adding extra protection to Crown land alone in this area will could add, you know, 70,000 hectares to the total that we're sort of aiming for, and we think it's sort of significant in that way. But there are many other features that make the Highlands Corridor really special. And I'm going to turn it over to Paul now to talk a little bit more about the values in terms of things like climate change resilience and habitat connectivity, and how the Highlands Corridor can contribute to those things in the province of Ontario. So I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Thanks,
and maybe
Shelley.
we can go to the next slide. Yeah.
So yes, what I wanted to really speak to is why the Highlands Corridor is a prime candidate for protection. And to do that, one of the first things I want to address is the natural infrastructure, specifically wetlands. Next slide, please. Wetlands represent, wetlands are really important, and particularly for flood attenuation. We know that wetlands can capture and hold water and slowly release it as the landscape dries. We know that it can redirect surface water into the groundwater, as well as just slow the flow of surface water down as it comes across, just with the physical structure of the plants. And so there's a huge value for wetlands in terms of helping us to deal with those issues like flooding. Next slide. And we also know that wetlands can store a vast amount of carbon. That wetland that you're seeing on there on the left is actually part of the Kendrick Creek wetland complex and is a large fen. If I was to walk out on that and punch my auger through, it would go down meters and meters and meters, probably 6 to 8 meters deep. And all underneath that mat of vegetation is this brown soupy material, which we call peat. That is locked up. And any change or alteration to that wetland would introduce oxygen, and that carbon would be released into our atmosphere. So seeing the size of these wetlands and recognizing this value in terms of carbon storage and flood attenuation, so it starts to really make you think about the natural infrastructure in this area. Next slide, please. So this sort of initiated some investigations that we had to sort of start looking at. We started looking at the wetlands in what we're calling the Highlands Corridor. And just to orient you, there's the Queen Elizabeth Wildlands Provincial Park to the west, and Kawartha Highlands to the south, and that orange boundary is the southern part of Haliburton County. Within this area, we identified since 2017, we've actually initiated some wetland evaluations, and we got out on the ground and evaluated 5 different complexes in the corridor, representing about 3,300 hectares of provincially significant wetland. Just over to the east, there's another, as we approach Silent Lake Provincial Park, we have the Potash Lake wetland complexes, which add another 530 hectares of provincially significant wetland in this corridor. Next slide, please. We also discovered through these evaluations that really we didn't understand the wetland representation in the Highlands Corridor as a whole either. So through a grant from Ontario Trillium Foundation, we initiated a project to actually map all the wetlands and really understand, to better understand that. It was a remote wetland exercise, mapping exercise, and with a field component to get out of the ground and really verify that our mapping was accurate. And actually, it was very interesting. Through mapping of the 3 townships, Lutterworth, Snowden, and Glenmorgan, we were able to identify and map all the wetlands, and it really showed us that the wetlands in this area are actually represent about 17.9% of the landscape, coupled with the lakes, that brings water up to about 25% of the landscape. Just to give you an idea of the significance of that, at the ecoregion level, water only represents 11%. And so what we're seeing is just a vast amount of water trapped and collecting in this corridor. We also, under an RBC grant, foundation grant, are now classifying those wetlands to better understand sort of which wetlands have high components of organic deposits and therefore store carbon. And from that, we've found that of that 17.9%, we're seeing 23% of those wetlands actually have deep organic deposits and therefore are storing carbon on our behalf. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the natural infrastructure, and just talking about wetlands alone, we see that it has exceptionally high representation of wetlands at 17.9%, and deep organic deposits through this area, which is, with about 23% of the wetlands having those organic deposits. Next slide. But it's not just about natural infrastructure. We also see there's a huge value of the Highlands corridor in terms of connectivity and biodiversity. We know that maintaining biodiversity is critical to maintaining healthy ecosystems, and we know that climate change will stress local populations, whether that be through catastrophic weather events or pest infestations or just local extirpations happening. A species survival will depend on this ability to move across the landscape. Of interest, this species here is actually a small-footed myotis, and during the Bark Creek wetland complex evaluation, we were out on the barren rock and we lifted just a loose piece of rock cover, and there was this the small-footed myotis roosting underneath that rock. That is one of the endangered species in the Highlands corridor. Next slide. Speaking of species at risk, the Land Trust actually initiated and maintained a database back in 2007 of community observations of species at risk. But we went further than just collecting it. We wanted to make sure that it was a robust database, and therefore we really took the effort to verify each of the observations, and that was through either photo documentation or consultation with a biologist, to make sure that the observations were accurate and pinpointed to a specific location. This database has grown. We've got about 3,500 observations in that database, but through that, it started to guide us in terms of conservation planning. And we really noticed that in the southern part of Haliburton, there was an incredible amount of biodiversity, far greater than elsewhere throughout the county. And now we know that there are 46 provincially significant species in the Highlands corridor, as well as 32 regionally and locally significant species. And by provincially significant, I mean endangered, threatened, species of special concern, or track species. This snake is actually a hognose snake, and it was identified on one of the Land Trust properties, the Doll Forest. And this photograph is from the Doll Forest, and is one of our species at risk. It's threatened in the Highlands corridor right now. Next slide, please. Looking at the connectivity piece, we see that we had Queen Elizabeth II Wildlands Park to the west. We had Kawartha Highlands Provincial Park to the south, and over to the east we've got the Silent Lake Provincial Park. But interconnected all between that is a vast amount of crown land. There's actually the representation of crown land is 60% between these parks. Coupled in and nestled in that crown land, the Land Trust has secured properties and has about 240 hectares. The township of Minden Hills has another 200 hectares in the municipal park. And then there's 3 areas of natural and scientific interest also scattered throughout this area. So we're starting to see this connectivity building and getting in place. Next slide, please. The community is also invested heavily in trying to secure the connectivity of this corridor. Back in 2014, under an Ontario Species at Risk Stewardship Program, we initiated a project to investigate the effectiveness of a turtle barrier wall and underpass to try and mitigate the impacts of turtle road mortality. The community was incredibly involved in this project, invested over 5,500 hours of volunteer time just to study this wall and make sure it's working. It was a robust study. It's ended up being published in the primary literature and is still recognized as an effective means and cost-effective way of enhancing connectivity throughout the area. So looking at this geographically then, next slide, please. We've got we can see there again, Kawartha on the west, and Kawartha, sorry, Queen Elizabeth on the west, and Kawartha Highlands to the south, and then over to the east is Highland Lake. That lighter green throughout the area is the Crown Land, representing 60% of the landscape. The darker green we've got is the provincially significant wetlands that we've identified in the area. The darker purple areas, those are land trust properties, again connecting that Crown Land. Snowden Municipal Park up there in sort of the center area of that slide, representing another 200 hectares right in there. And then just below where it says Snowden Municipal Park on that road, that's Galert Road, that is the Turtle Barrier Wall and Underpass, again enhancing connectivity throughout that area. And so you can start to see how it's all coming together. We're starting to build this beautiful area. We know the biodiversity is incredible in that area. We know it has the natural infrastructure that's so important to mitigating the impacts of climate change. But none of this would be possible unless the Crown Land itself is protected. And that is what we're striving to do. We've got the Crown Land protected so the land trust and everybody else can continue their work in protecting the landscape and building that connectivity. Next slide, please. Just to recognize the Ontario Trillium Foundation, again, has helped us with the funding for the mapping of the wetlands, Species at Risk Stewardship Fund for the turtle road mortality, and that was combined with ULinks. Climate Action Fund has helped us with the evaluation of some wetlands. Ontario Nature and RBC Foundation has certainly been instrumental in wetland evaluations as well. And all of these projects have been led by the Haliburton Highlands Land Trust, Ontario Nature, and myself, Landside Ecological Services Limited. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Shelley and Paul. Great presentation. Really great to have the specifics of that Highlands corridor, between the existing protected areas. And, we all know that Crown Land is the lowest level designation in terms of protection. And so, having worked at MNR, for example, for years, I know that Crown Land is also a place where a lot of things happen that it shouldn't. And so getting them protected and getting that higher level protection is really going to promote the preservation of biodiversity and, again, the movement across those corridors. So wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. So advancing slides here. And so the next speaker is going to be Gary Pritchard, and Gary is the conservation ecologist and Indigenous engagement specialist from Curve Lake. So Gary, if you're ready, please take it away.
I'm much, Brad. So Anin Ginu Nadinjakas Askishgamon Godam Dao. Good morning, everybody. My English name is Gary Pritchard. I come from Curve Lake First Nations, and I send greetings on behalf of my community to everyone who has participated today. With the gravity of what's happening throughout our territories, I thought I'd open with a prayer, and I'd like to start off by acknowledging a prayer of healing that I offered for all of us today, for this earth, for this land, for the water, and for the people, and for our language. A prayer of love and respect, a prayer of enlightenment and acceptance, a prayer of peace and hope. A prayer is offered for all of us who need to walk together, to guide our steps, to allow us to feel our shared presence in our life and remind us of the path we walk together. Typically, when you meet with Indigenous people, we often talk about all our relationships and all our relations together. And some people don't know what that means, so I thought I'd shed some light on that today. And Indigenous people fully embrace the notion that we're all connected together. It's funny when I meet people, I often talk about, well, that's my cousin, and everybody's, well, that's like your fifth or sixth cousin. I'm like, no, that's still my cousin, right? So that's some of the stuff that we talk about. We have a strong connection to our communities and the places that we live in, our ancestors, and the ones who yet to come in our future. We believe that we're all connected to this land, and every plant, every animal, and every creature that lives upon it is a part of our family. And that's something that we really need to start looking at through a shared knowledge system lens to help move these conservation objectives forward. I'd also like to share acknowledging this past year. We've collectively had to make changes to all our everyday lives, and I recently considered what we do, and I do struggle with coming on camera because of my internet connection, but whether or not we actually wanted to open up our homes and our personal spaces to the world to actually see each other and be a part of each other's lives again. So in every video call, video chat, or virtual meeting, we had to reveal our way of life to each other. From our pets barking to our children waving in the background, everybody has now had a glimpse into our lives. We all have invited positivity or negativity or even invasiveness into our personal spaces. For with that, I think we can all acknowledge we've had a shared experience together. If you magnify this shared experience in its most negative aspects, you might be able to see what it might have been like for my ancestors to open up our land and have our ways of life altered, to have to hide, to be pressured into signing trees, and whether we wanted to do that or not. I hope that we can reflect upon our current new experiences through this pandemic and look with more understanding of the historical experience that my ancestors had to share, to experience, to come together in a meaningful way. I encourage everyone to reflect on the words upon the land acknowledgement that we use. It's a recognition of this land that's occupied by my ancestors and the ancestors of my sister communities. We often take time to recognize the trees and land acknowledgement as well, because the treaty is what create a formal contractual relationship for my ancestors to share the lands and resources with their ancestors. It's the foundation for having space for all of us gathered today and run the operations and businesses to produce the outcomes that we all wish to achieve. Recognition and respect are the essential elements of establishing healthy and reciprocal relationships, and these relationships are key to reconciliation. I acknowledge that we will continue to have conflict in our shared journeys together. As we delve into meaningful consultation, meaningful relationship building, we must face the divide of opposite worldviews. We will have to overcome our painful history. We have the ability to rise to this change and challenge. We will emerge from this conflict, all of us together. I encourage all of us to include harmony and balance as part of our way of thinking and process. I can see this unfolding as how we hold our routine meetings together, talk about nature and conservation, and I hope we can also create a joint space for all knowledge systems, using both Indigenous oral and Western written systems to make informed decisions about the future. I have to emphasize the difference between being engaged and being understood. Being understood leads to effective joint planning that satisfies everyone. Being understood means to have our historic and ongoing rights sincerely considered in our conservation journey together. Being understood is our ultimate goal. To me, it's important that we treat each other with respect and equality, that we are viewed and valued as partners and not only in historical rights, but also the relationships we have agreed to be together, and that is to live together, to work together and share this space together. So with that, I'll start talking about the Jacks Lake area. It's first, before we even do that, I'd actually like to acknowledge the conservation effort of the Jack Lakes Association for their dedication and love for this area and maintaining its protection. Jacks Lake is actually just by the Petroglyph Park there that you see on my diagram. It's part of Treaty 20, and it's interesting when we talk about Treaty 20 and hearing others speak, but we always had conservation measures written within our treaty. Wetlands were actually always significantly protected within the obligations of the treaty. So actually, it actually says no settlers can actually harm wetlands with their daily operations. Forest stands had of level of significance for our people were always protected. Settlers could only own 6 inches of soil, and settlers could never hold titles around water. Ironically, that has never been fulfilled by the settler community, and so that's something we need to take away today as we look at expanding our conservation goals together. So where is Jacks Lake? In the Jacks Lake watershed is in the basically people understand as the county of Peterborough, and it touches the Peterborough Crown Game Preserve. It's just east of the Kawartha Highland Park, and a portion of the eastern part actually touches the Petroglyph Provincial Park. And for those who don't know the Petroglyph Park, it borders the south area of Jacks Creek, and it has one of the largest collections of petroglyphs or rock carvings in Canada, between 500 to 1,000 years old. So this shows a strong spiritual connection to this area. It's not just for hunting and fishing, it is actually a spiritual place of gathering. The name, people can't seem to agree on the name of Jack Lake or Jacks Lake, depending on who you are. But it was actually, our oral history tells us that Chief Jack Cow, or Handsome Jack, was the chief of that area. He claimed all the lands around Loon Lake, which is now today known as Chandos Lake, and Stony Lake. And he was the chief of the Mississaugas in the early 1800s. He was a really big man. He actually, in the 1800s, he was 6'4", and he weighed about 250 pounds. So he's a really big man. He always welcomed in settlers to hunt and fish and share the land, but if they started misusing the land, he would actually correct them. So that's something we need to take away there, is that if we start abusing the gifts, we have the right to take it away. And he would destroy traps that he found on his land that were not approved by him. He was very kind. He often enjoyed settlers coming in to do storytelling in his wigwam and sharing meals, and taught people how to survive in the landscape. He had 2 daughters, which he was very proud of. His eldest daughter, Polly Cow, died of terrible fever and illness, and she was buried on an island just south of Young's Point. And that's where we've heard that he spent his remaining days on the landscape. So for the Jacks Lake area, we know of the settler occupation as well as their impacts and land use of the area quite well. We, as the members of Treaty 20, are just starting to collect our oral histories and our traditional knowledge of the area. So we're actually in the process of collecting that information to help create effective conservation easements and management. But we've clearly understood the threats to the watershed. There's mineral exploration, crown and private forestry, over-harvesting of species from people migrating from the cities of Toronto up to the area. Urbanization, they're actually trying to go through a lighting bylaw system now for the lake, which I thought was insane, given where it was for people to have streetlights. Not adhering to the new 2018 delegated treaty of the Williams Treaty and the settlement parameters that have around that, around conservation and what people are referring to as crown lands. Water quality and alteration, and that all collectively impacts our Indigenous rights and title to that area. So that's something we need to start considering too. We start doing effective management. Ecological importance, like we've heard today, this is part of the land between and the transitional zone between 2 ecosystems. And it's really important, the corridor that runs from Georgian Bay all the way through the Kawartha to the Frontenac Arch. And we understand the importance of these areas, and we've used them traditionally for thousands of years. A quote from our consultation department: the Jacks Lake area is extremely significant to the citizens of Krelove Lake First Nation and other Michisaki communities. The surrounding lands of the lakes have been used for hunting, gathering, and harvesting by Michisagi and Anishinaabe for thousands of years. This land is not only culturally significant in terms of the Michisagi's ways of life and the continuation of transfer of culture and practices, but also for cultural heritage. There are several registered archaeological sites in the area, and we have to be acknowledging that when we start doing our current day exploration services. The land is rich in biodiversity, including wetlands, woodlots, and ancient sacred landscapes as well that we're not willing to share yet, but we know they're out there. People have approached us, and we've talked about it as councils, as creating this as an IPCA process, and I'm glad to see Marilyn today, and and I know her community is very successful at this, but we are actually in the process of looking at this area as an IPCA candidate. We do have some points to leave everybody with, is that IPCAs are designed for Indigenous governments to have the primary role in designing this, creating the objectives, boundaries, and management plans. This is not meant to be a settler-driven want and needs. We need to have a co-governance together. Unfortunately, our community in Krelove Lake, we are so, I'm going to use the term distracted by the negativity of settler development throughout the Gunshot Treaty, Treaty 20, that we don't have the opportunity to actually fully put attention onto this project. We wish we did. So there's an opportunity for partnering, but the NGOs need to actually help us, not lead it, but actually provide support for all of us. And that's what I asked for today. IPCAs are to elevate Indigenous rights to the land and not limit, and people need to understand that, right? Through our conservation methodologies, we're really good at restricting Indigenous use to landscapes, and this is the opposite of that. We want to actually enhance and return to some of our cultural practices on this landscape. And if you look at the Petroglyph Park, that was an area that we actually hid from the settler government for a long time because of its significance, afraid of it being destroyed. And that's one of the things that we need to revitalize and go through a journey of healing together. So in closing, I keep my mind open for future conversations and meaningful dialogue. And I thank all of you for your time, your attention, your commitment to working together, and for all our relations. And I'll pass it back to Brad and say miigwech to everyone.
Thank you very much, Gary. I really appreciate having spent myself 20 years representing the Crown, although not anymore. It's such a real pleasure to have you provide such a comprehensive overview of all the considerations in respect of settler Indigenous relationships and conservation. It's not nearly common enough to have people educated and have that kind of teaching, Gary. So really, really appreciate it. You've highlighted the classic land between in respect of the Williams Treaty. I know you'll recall there's a great documentary of the same name, but it's really an important in this idea of connectivity about this land that truly does kind of connect the Algonquin Parks and QE2s of the world with the Frontenac Arch and those other areas that are a little bit lower. And finally, I really appreciate that you acknowledge kind of the role of settler organizations and IPCAs, that they're there to support and not lead, and that needs to be said, I think, a little bit more. And I think that a lot of those settler organizations have, that's been a challenge for them to support and not lead. And so it's great to highlight that. And of course, petroglyphs right in there as a provincial park. And what people might not know, but certainly in your community know, Gary, is that the Ontario Parks built a big concrete structure around those petroglyphs to quote unquote protect them. And it's a shame that that structure is there and separates it from the water and all the other elements that maybe give those petroglyphs life. Certainly in the time I've spent in your community, I've heard that many times. So really appreciate your participation and really appreciate the guidance and teaching you provided us. So thank you very much. So we'll move from that, from our friend Gary, and we're going to move on here to the Catchacoma old growth forest. I've got a couple of folks here, Katie Krelove and Peter Quinby. And so I'll turn that over to you, Katie and Peter.
Thanks so much, Brad. Peter and I are really pleased to be here today to have the opportunity to talk about the special site that we've been working on since 2019 to protect for its rare old growth values. And the forest has come to be known as the Catchacoma Forest. And we've been working, as I said, with community to pursue protection for the forest. So if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so the Catchacoma Forest is located within a lot of those bubbles of connectivity that the other presenters have talked about. It is located on Crown land and on Mississauga Anishinaabeg territory, Williams Treaty 20. And it is about 662 hectares or just over 1,600 acres. And as you can see, it's located, it's actually adjacent to Kawartha Highlands Park, about 45 minutes north of Peterborough, north of Catchacoma Lake, where it's sort of derived its name from, and is also in Cavendish Township, is the township it's in. So the Catchacoma Forest was the site of a 2019-2020 survey done by Ancient Forest Exploration and Research, led by Dr. Peter Quinby. So Peter, maybe I'll pass it over to you right now while we're still on this slide to talk about sort of what prompted those surveys and what they consisted of.
Sure, I'll just add that the Catchacoma Forest is located on the west side of Kawartha Highlands Provincial Park, up in the northwest corner. But the Peterborough Old Growth Forest Project was funded by an Ontario Trillium Foundation grant that ran from March 2019 to February 2020. The goal of the project was to develop and test methods of involving citizen scientists and field surveys of old growth forests throughout all of Peterborough County. We ended up focusing pretty much only on the northern half because of the lack of good, decent imagery available for the southern part of the county. From our initial literature review, we learned about the Catchacoma Forest from a report titled
that was published in 2012 titled High Conservation Values in the Bancroft-Minden Forest, which was commissioned by the Bancroft-Minden Forest Company as part of the, I guess it was a support document for the previous 10-year forest management plan. Once we saw the mapping that showed that there was old growth forest in this location, we took a look at M&R's 1987 FRI data, and we looked further into the literature and found that it's the largest known eastern hemlock old growth forest in Canada. And for those reasons, we selected it to apply our newly developed protocols and to test them in the field with different groups and individuals. But one of the most productive partnerships that we developed was with Youth Leadership in Sustainability class based in Peterborough. This class is made up of grade 11 and 12 students. It's taught by Cameron Douglas, a very dynamic, dedicated teacher. Through this partnership, we were able to accomplish a number of things. The YLS class sampled 10 of 20 field plots that we used for this study. There were many old growth forest metrics that were determined from the data we got from these plots, including tree species, tree diameter, and density. 22 trees were aged, ranging from 105 to 375 years, indicating a multi-aged or uneven aged forest. They assessed snag species, snag diameter, density, and decay level. We also assessed log species, log diameter, volume, and decay level. And we assessed for cut, stump, density, and evidence of fire. We assessed other things as well, but those were the main old growth forest metrics. We compared these results with 38 Southern Ontario old growth forests evaluated by Larson et al. In a report they published in 1999 called The Woodland Heritage of Southern Ontario, that was published by the Ontario Nature. This comparison, basically there's very little, there's no standardization of old growth forest metrics for Ontario, actually for Canada, any province in this country, in addition to Ontario. So it's sort of in its infancy, and we really do need these standards. So this report that basically surveyed the 38 finest old growth forests in Southern Ontario, according to the authors anyway. This report provided a very useful sort of baseline for us. And when we compared a number of old growth forest metrics, all related to the metrics the variables that I previously mentioned, these old growth metrics for Catchacoma far exceeded the mean for all old growth forest metrics that were assessed in this report of 38 of Southern Ontario's best old growth forests. So there's no doubt that at least significant portions of this landscape are made up of old growth forests. We need some more time to investigate other portions of the forest. And so we need some time to do that. We also want to evaluate the wetlands that are there. So we've requested a 5-year moratorium to MNRF on the scheduled logging that is supposed to take place in the next 10 years by the Bancroft-Minden Forest Company, so that we can fully assess this high carbon, high biodiversity forest. Back to you, Katie.
Great, thanks, Peter. Yeah, so I've just listed there on this slide some of those conservation values that were discovered through the surveys by AFER. So largest known old growth eastern hemlock forest in Canada, by comparison between natural capital versus timber value, it's worth 10 times more standing than logged, home to at least 10 species at risk. One thing I'm not sure Peter mentioned, but is on average, we also found that the largest trees were on average 58 years older than the 2007 FRI data that the Forestry Company and MNRF rely on to age the forest. And all of those reports can be found at the website there, peterboroogoldgrowth.ca. Next slide, Brad. So, I mean, we haven't done comprehensive species at risk assessment, but from a study of sort of the literature and documentation, at least 10 species at risk have been noted in the Catchacoma forest. So Blanding's turtles, your five-line skink, cerulean warbler, eastern wood pewee, not pictured, and wood thrush, and even Algonquin wolf. It is partly moose, designated as a moose enhancement area as well. Next slide. So, I mean, a lot more work needs to be done. Surveys need to be done on the species, the wildlife. And one of the things we found was that there was a sort of lack of that sort of survey that had been done in the Catchacoma forest. Other conservation values, as Peter mentioned, they're unevaluated. All the wetlands within it are unevaluated as of right now. There are streams, creeks, open muskeg, small lakes. It's also very valuable in terms of accessible recreation. So as opposed to Highlands Park, which is right next door, it is quite accessible to locals. As I said, a 45-minute drive from Peterborough. There's a parking lot. It's already being used for a lot of recreational purposes, and has potential to be a really valuable, especially to the local community for low impact recreation. Also, I mean, the research and education. So, I mean, I love that little video that's played. Unfortunately, you couldn't hear the sound of the youth leadership and sustainability class who helped do some of the initial surveys and learn about old growth. They were actually singing in that video. Unfortunately, you couldn't hear. And you know, the teacher who led them, you know, talks about how much that experience affected the students, and that they still talk about it. It was their favorite field trip of the year. And then also, of course, the value for carbon storage and sequestration associated with old growth. Next slide. So yeah, overall, we've been trying to bring these conservation values to the community and to the MNRF and to the forestry company to say that old growth is worth more standing than it is logged. Next slide. So as we've mentioned, the Catchacoma Forest is licensed for logging to the Bancroft Forest Minden Company, and some logging, so in some of those pictures you might have seen, including the tall 375-year-old tree in the original slide, were marked for logging as AFIR was doing the 2019 and 2020 studies. And so that prompted us to do outreach and to try to pursue a moratorium on logging, on that year's logging, in order for more studies to be done and more surveys to be done on the old growth conservation values of the forest, the wildlife in the forest, as well as the wetlands. So you can see in this map here, B indicates where 2019 and 2020 logging occurred. It was actually not a huge amount. Part C, where you can see on this map, was slated for logging, but has now been put into contingency logging area, so potentially protected. And then Part A is currently scheduled for regular harvest over the next 10 years. So we did have the opportunity, because Bancroft Minden and MNRF was in the midst of planning, of developing the 10-year forest management plan, which opened up opportunity for us to try to submit these conservation values and ask for a moratorium on logging. So we actually formed, some of the outreach group work we've done is we've formed a small local community group called the Catchacoma Forest Stewardship Committee that did engage in the forest management planning process. We've held numerous public outreach and hikes to try to bring awareness to local community of the conservation values of the forest, the old growth values of the forest. As I've said, we've been engaging with the MNRF on the forest management planning through community consultation to request a moratorium on logging. So that we can do more field work, more environmental assessments, and also some hiking trail development. That is still ongoing. So we're actually currently in the issues resolution phase of the forest management planning process. And ultimately, what we would like is time to pursue a Crown land use amendment to turn this from general use to a conservation reserve, and to have time to develop that conservation reserve vision. Next slide. So yeah, so some of the problems we've encountered in terms of trying to bring these conservation and bring our case for moratorium on logging is that, as I mentioned, the forest inventory data that is being used for the forest management plan 2007 FRI data underestimates the age of the Catchacoma forest. So so what we've encountered is kind of a brick wall in terms of actually getting Peter and AFER's work acknowledged to identify this as old growth and as rare ecosystem. We've encountered that MNRF has been under resources in species at risk habitat identification, and of course that's been exacerbated by COVID. And of course that Ontario has sort of no province-wide coordinated plan to identify and protect more land to meet commitments. So, you know, in addition to reaching out to MNRF in the forest management planning process, we've also been trying to reach out to MECP, the Ministry of the Environment, and are just sort of getting no response, or the response has been like, there's no mandate, it seems, to actually consider this site for conservation. So yeah, I'll end it there. I'm not even sure if I have a next slide. Is there a next slide? So this is, again, the high school class. We're really into the work that they did there, and they produced this image. So thanks, and we look forward to any questions.
Well, that's really great. Thank you, Katie and Peter. Really great presentation. It's interesting, Hemlock Forest is actually my favorite forest, and so I love how dark and mysterious it generally tends to be. Hemlock, of course, from a wood value perspective, actually is very low value wood, right? It's hard to cut, it's hard to mill, it doesn't dry, so it's a green product. You know, it finds its way into pulpwood and pallets and all sorts of stuff that we could probably do differently. And so, you know, it's not surprising they took Area C there out of production, because hemlock is really hard to deal with from a logger's perspective. So we wish you luck, and we're really supporting you there. It's great to highlight the carbon capture of a slow growing species like hemlock. So that's great work. Thank you very, very much. So we are moving from hemlock into the Kawartha Land Trust. And so we have John Kintare here, and John is going to talk to us about the East Kawartha Lakelands. So welcome, John.
Great, thank you, Brad. You can go straight to the next slide, please. People don't need to know who I am, I guess. Yeah, so I wanted to talk today about Kawartha Land Trust a little bit and what we do and how we operate, and then talk about one of the priority areas we've identified that connects into some of the other work that the other organizations have spoken to today. So it's important to note we are a nonprofit and a charity, and we work primarily, almost exclusively actually, in private land. So we talked earlier today about crown lands and unceded territory. And before I get into that, I should note that I'm here in Bobcaygeon, and I live and work in Treaty 20 Mississauga territory, and the traditional territory of the Mississauga and the Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nation. And truly the work, the love and care of the land that those Williams Treaty First Nations have had for thousands of years is what makes it possible for Kawartha Land Trust to exist today. It's left us nature that's worth protecting, and that's truly the mission and vision of KLT. You can go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we work primarily in private lands, and KLT has been going since 2001, so we're just coming up to our 20th anniversary. So we operate within Peterborough County and the city of Kawartha Lakes. And those two municipalities are situated within the watersheds that are managed by the Otonabee Region Conservation Authority and the Kawartha Region Conservation Authorities, who together manage a total of 33 tertiary watersheds. So there's certainly, as you would imagine from the Kawartha Lakes, there's quite a lot of water that we deal with here as well. So over the years, primarily through, again, accepting donations of lands from private landowners who are conservation minded and concerned about their natural environment, we have had quite an impact on the landscape. And you can see both from the map there and that impact slide, the types of land that we protect and the way that we do that. And it is truly very much involved in involving the community in that protection. We seek to work collaboratively wherever possible, both with Williams Treaty First Nations, with developers even, with loggers, with industry, but also with private landowners and concerned citizens who want to see the land that they love protected. And so we do leave the crown land to others, and we're very grateful for the work that they do, and try and work on the private lands, which often are a little bit more south of the region. If you go to the next slide, please, it'll be a overall map of our entire region. And you can see there's kind of an orange coloring there to some of that land. And that's the Kawartha's Naturally Connected Preferred Scenario, or KNC. And so KNC was a 10-year research project that was conducted collaboratively with a number of different partners and stakeholders, including federal, provincial, and municipal representatives, First Nations, members of advisory councils, lake associations, conservation authorities, and others, to try and identify a natural heritage system for our region, for the Kawarthas. That would encompass the lands and waters within those watersheds, as well as a 5-kilometer buffer outside of those boundaries. And so this research project, sought to identify key ecological values, was looking for biodiversity representation, was looking for ecological functions and a kind of coarse scale habitat investigation, obviously looking at watershed functionality and other landscape features as well. But the preferred scenario balanced all of those features with kind of socio-political values. So prime agricultural lands, existing extraction areas, roads, highways, major arterials, et cetera, to try and come up with a natural heritage system that a large swath of our community could get behind. And so following up on that, Kawartha Land Trust over the last 3 years has been working with an Ontario Trillium Fund grant to look at community conservation and engaging the community in a more fulsome way in conservation in our area. And to do so, we've identified these 4 priority areas where we have a concentration of protected lands, a concentration of landowners who are interested in conservation, and a high concentration of donors as well, who are able to help us in our work there. So if you could go to the next slide, please, I'll introduce the East Kawartha Lakelands focal area. And I chose this one to focus on because one of those earlier images we saw with the Highlands corridor had a beautiful kind of oval, and it just barely touched this one. So I thought I'd talk about this priority area today. It's not that it's more important than the other ones, but it kind of fits into this notion of connectivity between QE2 and Kawartha's signature site and beyond in the land between. So the East Kawartha Lakelands priority area is a mixed hardwood and boreal ecozones and ecosystems. And the species that they support are unique, and especially that ecotone, or the land between, is a very unique feature of this landscape. So within, as you look at this, this priority area, you can see that there are a number of naturally connected corridors already that are used by wildlife. And there's also many regionally and provincially significant species found in this area. So as you look at the Kawartha's Naturally Connected, the preferred scenario there, and you look at the already existing protected lands, you can see some of these corridors that kind of naturally lend themselves to protection. And again, if you think about the lands that we operate on, which are primarily private rather than rent crown, that kind of puts our focus a little bit further south as well. Although there's certainly some great protection to be done leading up into Kawartha Highlands signature site and across between those two provincial parks there as well. So there are a number of provincial parks, a number of ANSIs, areas of natural and scientific interest, a number of provincially significant wetlands in this area, as well as some significant land holdings that KLT owns and manages, some Autonomy Region Conservation Authority lands, and some municipal lands as well. All of which kind of contribute to an area that's still quite natural. There's a lot of development there, but it still feels quite natural when you're in it, and gives us that opportunity to kind of see that that natural connectivity continue if we can find a way to protect those private lands and see that they're protected and conserved in perpetuity. So I guess just one kind of project that I might highlight, and interestingly, it's not on this map, unfortunately, because we just completed it last year, but was the Christie Bentham wetland property, which is just south of Burley Falls. And this is a property that encompasses the vast majority of the Clear Lake North provincially significant wetland. And it was a property that was well known and well loved by the community. There's a series of trails through that property that have been, I would say, they've been trespassed on for generations. I won't go quite as far back as Gary did to figure out exactly how much trespass there's been, but certainly that property has been in private hands of a private developer for the last several decades. And a number of lots have been carved off of that property to build cottages on. So when that property came up for sale again in 2020, and the community wanted to find a way to protect it and asked Kawartha Land Trust if we could partner with them to do so, we got out and did an ecological survey of the site, and of course found significant ecological values both in the wetland and in the upland forest. And we were able to work with that community to launch a public fundraising campaign. We got an agreement with the landowner who was willing to sell us the land at a reduced cost from what he had it listed at. And then we had to raise those funds within the community. And we had 6 weeks to do it in. We had planned to give ourselves 6 months, but that didn't quite work out. And amazingly, that community came together, raised over $750,000 to allow us to purchase that property, as well as setting up a stewardship fund to protect it in perpetuity and serve for its stewardship needs over time. An additional landowner came forward as part of that campaign and donated another 35 acres adjacent to that site. And we've had several other conversations that have sparked with other conservation-minded landowners in that area and a corridor leading south to Young's Point and Lakefield, who are also interested in looking at both help with current conservation goals and permanent protection options. And so what we're seeing here with the invigoration and the use of the community, with kind of broadening our scope beyond just pure ecological function and looking at the community love side of things and what the land that people love and love to be on and connecting them with it, we've really seen the ability to invigorate a large swath of our society and get them involved in conservation in a way that they may not have been before. And so I think as we look at connectivity and as we look at even at Crown lands and bringing those in, there's a huge role to be played there in terms of bringing the people along with us and taking advantage of their power and their interest in seeing some more conserved lands and protected lands here in Ontario. I know we're short on time, so I think I'll stop it there, other than just to say thank you, Miigwech. And again, Gary talked about the Jacks Lake Association, and I'd just like to say, KLT, again, we wouldn't exist, we wouldn't have properties protected if it weren't for so many dedicated and caring individuals who have protected that property before us. And so we're really grateful for all of those folks to make our work possible, to see permanent protection as an option. Thanks, Brad. I'll turn it back to you.
That's really terrific, John, and thank you for that acknowledgement. It's important that all of us realize that, in Ontario, there's a mosaic of land trust organizations like the Kawartha Land Trust, and they do really great work locally. They connect with communities remarkably well. And, as much as we get excited about a new national park or a new territorial or provincial park, it's awesome to see the work that's happening in the local kind of area. Having been a resident of Peterborough for a time, John, it's great to see that work is happening there too. So thank you very much. The next part of our afternoon today is to talk a little bit, or to hear from Mark Bisset. And Mark has got a video for us from the Couchiching Conservancy. And Mark is going to talk to us in the video about the work of the Couchiching Conservancy. And so I'm going to pass it over to my technical folks who I think are going to be able to run the video here.
Hello, I'm Mark Bisset. I'm the Executive Director of the Couchiching Conservancy, and we're out here this afternoon at Grants Woods. I want to talk to you today about our acquisition strategy. It's something that we've been working on over the last 2 or 3 years in conjunction with several other land trusts, Oak Ridges Moraine and the Huronia Land Conservancy being the 2 primary ones. And it was a project that was supported by the McLean Foundation, so we're very grateful to them. What we set out to do is identify areas in Simcoe County and to the west of Simcoe County in the city of Kawartha Lakes, which is also part of our coverage region, that are the most important areas to protect over the next few years. And we used all sorts of data, species at risk data, habitat data, stuff from the reptile and amphibian atlas, the breeding bird atlas, every source we could find to create what amounted to a heat map for our region. And that way we were able to identify these biological hotspots, and then we zero in on them and try to protect habitat inside those zones to the best of our ability to create connectivity. Now, connectivity is really, really important, and it's something that has really informed our decision-making process throughout this exercise. This is the Nature Conservancy's Migration in Motion map, and what it is a model over the next century for species moving from south to north in the face of climate change. And it's really sobering. When you zoom in on our region, you can see how important it is in terms of natural connectivity. So what we came up with are essentially 5 focus areas that are all interconnected. You may be familiar with the Cardin Alvar. That's where we've been working, I think, the most efficiently over the longest period of time with our various partners like the Nature Conservancy of Canada, Ontario Parks, Wildlife Preservation Canada, and we've put up some really good results there, collectively protecting thousands of acres of really important alvar and grassland habitat. The second focus area we identified was the Black River Wildlands Corridor. And you may have heard something about that corridor in our various news releases. We're currently in the middle of a campaign to raise funds to acquire as much land in that corridor as we can over the next few years. Matchedash is another area. That's the most northerly portion of our coverage area. It's got several areas of natural scientific interest in it. It's got a lot of crown land in it as well. So really, really big intact sections of natural habitat. Bass Lake West is another one. We previously thought of this as the Oro Moraine, but we made some changes and refinements in this version. And so Bass Lake West represents sort of our best opportunities in that area. And then to the west, and this corridor would be shared with possibly the Nature Conservancy of Canada, Huronia Land Conservancy. In that section, we've identified something we're calling the Minising to Matchedash corridor. It is really critical, I think, going forward in terms of that connectivity map that I showed you previously. So as we go forward, we don't need to own all this property. We can work with numerous partners to try and create a connected corridor through these regions. We have lots of partners to work with. Ontario Parks, Nature Conservancy of Canada, the province of Ontario, and really important in all this, we think, will be private landowners, because we can never own all the property that we hope to bring under protection, but working with private landowners, I think we can bring a level of protection to these corridors that will stand the test of time. So this acquisition this acquisition strategy is a roadmap for the next 25 years for the Couchiching Conservancy, so that we can generate a lot more of this. And maybe it will stand up much longer than 25 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark, in absentia, for your video. It was really great to hear about the acquisition strategy of the Couchiching Conservancy, who are doing really terrific work in that area just above Aurelia. Certainly the protection of Cardinalvar as a provincial park was where the Couchiching Conservancy had a really important role in that becoming a provincial park, along with those other partners. We've come to the Q&A portion of our session, and so all of our presenters have done such a wonderful job. We know we have collected some questions, and we're fortunate enough to have our friend Ian Attridge here, who's going to moderate the Q&A portion, and so I'll turn that over to Ian.
Miigwech, Brad, and I'm coming to you from the Godwinong, Peterborough in the central Ontario area, and I'm really grateful to all the speakers, but particularly to the Indigenous folks, the Mississauga and Anishinaabe in Treaty 20 and the Williams Treaty and other treaties that are connected to this area and have sustained this area for so many years, and continue, as Gary has done today, to give us lessons, remind us of our treaty relationships, both among people, but also in treaty with all our relations, as Gary was talking about. I just amazed by the incredible work that all of these organizations are doing, and that so many people are doing on the landscape to connect with possibilities. And, you know, I was amazed. One of the things I took from the presentations was the maps. I love maps because they capture what we see, what we value, and what our visions of what we can be together. And when I think about connectivity, I think of connections of place, people, partnerships, and policy. I'm a lawyer after all, so I gotta add that part to it. And so I wanted to ask a question, starting with Gary, recognizing that, and great news. Thanks, Brad, for announcing that again. The passing by the Senate yesterday of Bill C-15 on UNDRIP. Lots of work ahead, but an important step. And maybe we can start with Gary and then the other panelists. What are some of the policy directions that you see would help to advance your work to make that easier, less expensive, and more efficient? So turn it over to my friend Gary and then some of the other panelists.
Go ahead, Ian. I totally knew you were going to ask me first. Well, I think one of the greatest challenges, and I've seen this a lot lately, and I've been doing a lot of reviews on for different projects happening around our territory on behalf of my community, and it's the vagueness of Western policy. I guess I would call it. I think I would try to really word this better, especially when I've raised it formally to the Crown. But that's why I have lawyers, like you, Ian. And so it's like I love it when we look at Western definitions of things. So if you look at like wetland protection, for example, it's up to 120 meters. Right? Who's defining what up to really is? And I always find that entertaining because we have some people on the lower end of it, some of us on the higher end of it. You know, and it's like, well, no, you should just say, okay, wetland protection will be 120 meters, right? That's that whole indecisiveness of European Western science, because we're afraid to make a formal decision on something. It's like, say, when you go, it's a good idea to consult with the local Indigenous community. No, you should consult with the local, you just should have to do that, right? It's just very simple ways to implement policy. I see as a challenge, right? It's funny because we're always like, when people provide us documents, it's so vague, but they try to be so prescriptive in the vagueness, and it is really challenging on this ecological protection. right? We will not cause significant harm. Please define, we always ask, please define significant, right? Under whose knowledge system, under whose interpretation, and things like that, right? And those are those key definitions. The other part is like, how do people, like, especially with our territory, we've had a more modern day settlement in 2018. No one operated in our territory even acknowledges that, except like from a proponent driven side. Not everybody here on the conservation side, so I should be very clear on what I'm saying. So like proponents do not know there's like treaty rules they have to like go around. They talk about the provincial policy, the DFO, Fisheries Act, you know, significant wildlife habitat, but they don't actually acknowledge our rights at all in the process. And that's actually in our territory incorrect because of the 2018 settlement. So there's that lack of education there as well. And I think if we start doing that more, we can start getting more cohesive environmental protection within policies and implementation. And I'll pass it to the rest of the group.
Thanks, Gary.
I think one thing I want to jump in there, Ian, on policy. There, in some cases, I think we see good policy in place in terms of wetland protection and species at risk, but the implementation of that policy seems to be where it's failing. Site alteration is occurring right across our landscape all the time. Numerous wetlands are being filled in despite the policy and official plans saying, "Oh, we recognize and love wetlands," and yet it's happening. And same with species at risk habitats. We know these wetlands are important to land use turtle, yet they're being filled in, yet they're being damaged. We're also seeing a lack of protection of wetlands on Crown land, wetlands that are provincially significant. So we know the province provides direction to municipalities to protect wetlands in accordance with the provincial policy statement, but nothing that doesn't apply to Crown land. And so there's actually a wetland act to say we got to protect wetlands this way. And so there's another shortfall as well.
Thanks, Paul. Don?
I was going to try and jump in there on the private land side. I think everything that's been said is bang on, and you know, often that concern about how policies are implemented is where people start turning to the private land solutions and permanent protections through land trusts. And so I mean, the one, there's all sorts of things that would make my life easier, but the one that I think I want to highlight is the legislation around the conservation easement agreements, or the Conservation Land Act. For folks who don't know, it's a really neat tool for private land conservation, because it allows you as the landowner to continue owning the land, but you work collaboratively with the holder of the easement, in this case a land trust, to decide what the restrictions are for future use on that land. And so you can say, well, we've got this wetland and maybe it's not provincially significant, but that doesn't mean it's not important. And we want to make sure that no future landowner can do X, Y, and Z, you know, in order to harm that wetland. And then the land trust becomes the enforcement body in a way. And the change, I think, policy-wise or legislation-wise, it would be great if there were also not only the land trust as the enforcers, but if there were other both, I think, benefits to people registering easements, possibly in terms of property tax or what have you, but then also enforcement in terms of there being some teeth, legislative teeth around adhering to those covenants as well.
Great. Thanks very much, John. And I think we're getting close to our time on questions, but we did receive a question about the use of the term Crown lands and how that can be seen as offensive, and it continues to really show that acquisition or that assumption of Crown responsibility and use of those Crown lands. And there's a question about abolishing that term. And just yesterday in the mail, I just we'll email this out as a resource. But Ontario Nature, in their On Nature magazine, just came out, and the very last page, written by Tom Cowie, who's one of our friends at Hiawatha First Nation, just south of Peterborough, has written an article there on the last page. I'll just show the cover, maybe backwards for you. We'll email this out, but it's an article that will help to explore that. And there certainly are other materials out there. So I think there's lots more that we can tease out from this conversation. Just really appreciate all the efforts of people on the ground and the kind of collaboration. I really appreciated in Mark Bisset in his video, speaking of partners and the importance, as Gary reminds us, and as we know as treaty partners, to be in consultation and to have free, prior, and informed consent in working with the people who have traditional responsibilities and continuing responsibilities for these lands. And so I'll pass that back to Brad as we're wrapping up. Hey, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for the great questions. Of course, policy questions are sometimes the hardest questions, and the policy landscape does need to change. And so I'm glad to see that we're asking those questions, particularly in respect of the term Crown land, which is a term that does need to change. And so that's really great to surface that here. I do want to thank all of the presenters and participants. Thank you, Dave and Shelley, Paul, Gary, Katie, Peter, John, Mark in absentia in the video, and Ian. I want to say thank you to Daniel and Megan, who are supporting us in the background here from a technology perspective. It's actually been pretty flawless. And now that I say that, my internet will cut out instantly. But it's been a really great session focusing on connectivity. We appreciate the efforts of everybody here that has presented. We appreciate you very much for attending and listening to us. And we ask you for your ongoing participation and advocacy, because this is really important work. That's why we're here, and there should be more of us here. There should be more of us listening. And so I'll say to the attendees, that'll be your job that we give to you, is to carry forward what you've learned here and to promulgate that in your communities. So thank you very much. It's been an honor to be with you, and have a terrific day. And I look forward to seeing you in future sessions. Thank you.